The following program has been pre-recorded, so please don't call in at this time. If you wish to participate in the program, tune in at 5 p.m. every Wednesday for A Pause for Thought on Baton Rouge Community Radio. Good evening, fellow humans. This is Wayne Parker with A Pause for Thought here on Baton Rouge Community Radio, 96.9 FM. Here in Baton Rouge. Well, we are glad to be here. Lang, good evening.
Howdy, Wayne.
I hope you all are glad to be here as well. I'd like to remind everybody this is a live call-in show. 343-9927 is the number to call. 343-9927 to share your thoughts, questions, challenges, or what have you with us here on the air. And our topic for tonight is America's infrastructure. I believe my promo said how do we compare with the rest of the world, but really I'd like to discuss how our future looks with the current state of our infrastructure and what, if anything, is being done about it. So let's start off, Lang, with discussing just what is considered infrastructure.
Well, from looking at it in preparing for this show, there's what we usually think of when they're talking about an infrastructure bill to improve the infrastructure, and that's the hard stuff like roads and bridges and ports and airports and even things like the water systems and the wastewater systems and whatnot. But infrastructure also, from a more academic understanding of it, includes all your what they call soft infrastructure, things like your schools and education system,
okay,
and your law enforcement agencies.
I wanted to clarify my question, just to make sure we know where we're starting from. Those are examples of infrastructure,
right?
Okay, but why are they called infrastructure is what I'm getting at. And the definition I have here is infrastructure is the basic physical and organizational, which is basically hard and soft, I guess, like you're saying, structures and facilities, e.g. buildings, roads, and power supplies, needed for the operation of a society or enterprise. So basically, everything that society in general, if we want to take this country as a whole, requires is going to be called infrastructure. To function, it requires to function. And disregarding whether or not if we had stayed in subsistence farming type economy, if we wouldn't have needed so much infrastructure or whatever. But anyway, that's what infrastructure is, and the examples you're citing are
examples, right?
Right, but they're roads, canals.
Yeah, and a lot of the focus is on, I guess you could call it, categories of systems, hard and soft, that support the economic activity of the country.
Right, but also, too, like you were mentioning, we have our sanitation, water treatment, sanitation, water supplies,
right,
which are necessary when you have large concentrations of people, because you need to process the waste, need to get clean, safe water to the people, that kind of thing.
Yes, and industry also requires a way to handle its waste and a way to provide its inputs, including water.
Right, and yes, and then of course electrical distribution and whatnot. All these things, like I asked you before the show, back when this country was formed, when we were 13 states, infrastructure consisted, and I'm talking about the hard stuff here. We had canals, we had some roads,
imports.
And ports, because we did a lot of traveling by ship, right, up and down the East Coast, because we didn't have the West yet. But there was a lot of traffic on the water, and of course, I think we must have built some canals, or the states did, whatever, but we didn't have a whole lot of things we called infrastructure back then, because we didn't have as many people. The technology wasn't there, the inventions were yet to come. So, whereas today, like you said, we have canals, the Suez Canal, the Panama Canal. That's global infrastructure there, but We have our interstate highway system. Before that, we had the federal highway system.
And then we've got the interconnected electrical grid.
Yes. Yes, that I'm thinking, I don't know that it's entirely interconnected across the country, or it can be, but
At least in large measure.
in large measure, yeah. I'm pretty sure we can normally, or we do, transmit power everywhere in the country.
Yeah, I think it was 2003 when they suspected it was a tree limb in Ohio that brought down the whole northeast,
yeah.
including up into Canada.
Well, yeah,
Cascading effect of interconnected electrical supply systems, where one went down, so it called upon more power from what it was interconnected to, and they couldn't meet the surge, and so
Right.
they fell, and it's like dominoes.
Yeah, that was like a certain power plant here in the Baton Rouge area back in the 80s that put their main generator online with their main transformers connected to ground, which is a safety measure. If you have to work around stuff, you ground it. And they took down everything all around Baton Rouge for the same reason. 93,000 or million amps, I think, were drawn straight to ground. Just pulled everything offline. But yeah, that 2003, the blackout in the Northeast, I think was traced to just poorly maintained electrical distribution systems. It's just old, antiquated equipment that nobody's responsible for generally. And I'm not sure about that whole story there, but it showed the importance of infrastructure. And
Right, and the complexities when it gets larger and larger.
Right, when it gets larger and larger, and who's going to maintain it. Such things aren't sexy politically, I suppose, so they don't get touted that much until they start getting really bad. But anyway, let me check my notes here. We talked a little bit about what infrastructure is, and of course, I guess the internet now is considered essential to society.
Yeah, and so the broadband system is in the news now and then about who has it and who doesn't and why.
Yeah, and as a matter of fact, the cell phone network was key to developing a lot of areas in Africa. I remember reading a few years back in The Economist, because they didn't have the wealth, they didn't have the anything that they needed to build hard, telephone infrastructure, communications infrastructure, no roads. So, but they could build cell phone towers fairly quickly and relay all the way across the continent with that.
Yeah, I think they refer to that as leapfrog technology, where
That's
they
the word I was
jump
looking
over
for,
the
yeah.
in-between stages and go straight to something that's... And that I've heard recently about the use of solar power in remote areas in Africa to leapfrog over the need for large electric distribution systems to provide local power.
Yeah, we could probably have that here in the United States also, except as I recall, I had a guest a couple years ago here talking about the battle to allow solar power and power sharing in the Baton Rouge area or Louisiana, because the utilities have a lot of money invested in those things, and they don't, in generators, and they don't want to share.
Yeah, well, I think that may be one of the problems with improving infrastructure in general, is vested interests in keeping the old systems, when moving to a newer system would actually provide a more secure and more reliable service of the function that the infrastructure is,
but
for.
Can you give specifics on infrastructure? Because I'm thinking
Well,
nobody wants our bridges falling apart.
Yeah, well, I was just generalizing out of the
Right.
specific that you were giving about
Sure, the electrical distribution. I mean, they have a lot of money, a lot of stockholders' money, public money, I guess, the ratepayers, we pay into it, and all that money is invested in hard stuff. And so it would be damaging, I guess, to the economy and us if we were to quickly swap everything over. But
And another example would be the vested interest the fossil fuel industry has against converting to renewables.
yes, unfortunately, but here again, look at how dependent we are now on petroleum products. I mean, so many drugs are made from petroleum. You know, it's almost like I don't know. We have a tiger by the tail, so to speak. But anyway, getting back in my, if I may.
Sure.
I did want to point out one thing from a historical perspective regarding infrastructure. Something I came across years ago when I was a libertarian zealot. But everybody today talks about how we need the interstate highway system is constitutional because it serves for the common defense, general welfare, promotes interstate commerce, blah, blah, blah. And yet when James Madison was president, and keep in mind he was considered the father of the U.S. Constitution, but he vetoed a bill that would have set aside federal monies to build interstate highways and canals back then. And he said that it was not covered by anything in the Constitution. And he specifically addressed the provide for general welfare and common defense, the interstate commerce, and what was the other one he looked at here? Oh, they also used the power to create all laws necessary and proper, and he explained that didn't apply either in this instance. So, but you know, look how things change, you know, and we don't need to. I don't care to argue for or against such things, but just how much things have changed since then. And do you recall when our U.S. highway system was made?
No, I don't know when the old U.S. highway system was made. That the interstate, I believe, started with the Eisenhower administration.
Right.
But I do know that in the late 1920s, when my dad was a kid and his family drove from Oklahoma out to Colorado, there was no highway system. They went following the telegraph lines.
Wow.
That's how people drove their cars. They did have like a Model A or something like that, but so there was no, at least in that part of the country, there was not a federal highway system.
Yes, of course. And I recall there are old Western movies, black and whites. I don't think they had sound back then either, but they showed cars and the horse-driven stagecoaches on roads out in the West, because you know that was all there was.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, you mentioned the telegraph. That was instrumental also in allowing the expansion and development of the West, as far as civilization, such as we call it.
Yeah, and
that was. Go ahead.
That also, within a few years, they were laying
the Transcontinental Railroad.
Well, they were laying transoceanic telegraph cables, and so the whole globe was connected for instantaneous transmission of information from the telegraph age.
Right.
The late telegraph age.
That's true, yeah. And that's, well, you know, I think I might like to look into how they managed to transmit telegraph signals across the ocean. I mean, that would have had to have taken, those are huge line losses is what I'm thinking. You know,
Mm-hmm.
You're going to lose, electrically, you'd need some kind of serious power source to get it all the way across there. You couldn't have relay stations out in the ocean, I don't think. But all that stuff helped the growth of civilization, I suppose, or accelerated it. It wasn't necessary. You know, we weren't sitting around saying, wow, if we had a telegraph system, we could grow faster. So the growth was due to, you know, a result of the telegraph system, as well as other infrastructure.
Yeah, well, here's a short little quote about that time period. The first successful transatlantic telegraph cable was completed in 1866. And within 29 years of the first telegraph installation in London, which was back in 1837, telegraph network crossed the oceans to every continent but Antarctica, making instant global communication possible for the first time.
Wow.
So that was shortly after the Civil War, an instant global communication by telegraph.
Interesting. And, you know, we've talked a little bit about, I think we did a long time ago, about maritime commerce and how we talked about steam engines, I think it was, and the first steam-driven freight ship revolutionized the maritime industries, because they weren't so dependent on winds. they could now, have schedules and actually predict when things were going to get to certain places, and so they could. It created a whole boom in worldwide commerce, or increased worldwide commerce for the maritime. Same thing with railroads, like in the United States, the Transcontinental Railroad. Of course, first we had to kill off all the buffalo before we could run trains safely across the plains. But that's another story, I suppose. But anyway, I wanted to talk about this because I remembered the Trump administration making a big thing about fixing infrastructure when it first, when Trump was running for president. And I just saw an article in The Economist here, I'm looking at it here, where it states that infrastructure seems the likeliest to come to something, talking about upcoming legislation. It says the White House and Senate Democrats have already released competing infrastructure proposals. And actually, I looked those up, and those were back in early this year, February and March, because they all recognize that our infrastructure is deteriorating, so to speak. And as I think we've at least agreed amongst ourselves here, you and me, or is it you and I? Anyway, infrastructure is important. We are highly dependent upon all of our infrastructure. And so I wanted to look into the condition of our infrastructure and how we compare to everyone else. And first, I'd like to remind the listeners, you're listening to Wayne Parker and Lang Baker here on A Pause for Thought. We're talking about infrastructure in the United States, its current condition, what may or may not be done to save it, and how, or get it back up to where we need it to be so that we don't run into trouble. 343-9927 is the number to call. 343-9927 if you have anything to contribute to this discussion. I'm looking at a report here, infrastructure report card from 2017, Lang, on bridges by the American Society of Civil Engineers. And the summary states that the United States has 614,387 bridges, and almost 4 in 10 are 50 years old or older. And as I recall, concrete begins deteriorating after about 50 years. It starts declining fairly quickly, but I'm not sure of that. Maybe someone else can clarify. But this summary here also goes on to state that 56,007 of our bridges, or 9.1% of the nation's bridges, were structurally deficient in 2016. And on the average, there were 188 million trips across structurally deficient bridges each day. And the ASCE says here that it's going to require $123 billion. Well, there's a $123 billion backlog in bridge rehabilitation in this country right now. So we're not keeping up with the decline and the aging of our bridges. And they define structurally deficient, let's see, as structurally deficient bridges that require significant maintenance, rehabilitation, or replacement. These bridges must be inspected at least every year, since critical load-carrying elements were found to be in poor condition due to deterioration or damage. And you were saying before the show, Lang, about the bridges here in Louisiana, or roads anyway, or bridges it was, load limits and whatnot. They're declining so much that it's proving a problem for the sugarcane growers. Yeah,
it was in the news a year or two ago, back when the legislature was considering proposals from a study group that had made recommendations on what was needed to bring the Louisiana roads and bridges up to par. In one of the examples they gave, they talked to some sugarcane producers and how they were having to route their loads to avoid these bridges. They couldn't handle the weight of their loads. They either have to reduce their loads and make more trips, or route the transport of their loads to where it took them twice as long or more to get to their destination because they couldn't cross these bridges. So it's having a severe economic impact on their operations.
Sure, and their equipment. I mean, if they have to travel farther, their equipment's going to need more maintenance over a shorter period of time. Frequent trips across the bridges, if they have to reduce the loads, is going to increase the deterioration of the roads as well as the bridges. So it kind of snowballs or whatever. I guess the legislature took care of that problem, right?
No, they didn't follow through on any of the recommendations that had been presented to them. So maybe I'll be back at the next session. I don't know.
Yeah, sooner or later, we're going to find out, and something is going to need to be done both at the state as well as the national level.
And your figure from their report card on bridges was 100 and something billion. Is that correct?
For the bridges only, yeah.
Yeah, for the bridges.
123 billion.
The United States Department of Transportation for roads and bridges combined came up with a figure of 800 billion. It's needed to bring them up to
800 billion.
The roads and bridges.
Roads and bridges, right?
Problem. Yeah. And in the American Society of Civil Engineers, they gave letter grades to 16 different categories of infrastructure issues. You were reporting on specifically on bridges, but they had 15 other categories, and the grades ranged from D. I think the lowest was a D minus up to a C plus, and the overall rating was a D plus.
Wow!
And the number they came up with for all 16 of these combined to bring them up to standard was something like $1.5 trillion. So there's a lot of need out there just to bring infrastructure up to standard.
Yeah, and sooner or later, this has got to bite us. You know, it's just people need to understand it. Now, the railroads, as far as I know, are maintaining their equipment to high standards.
Yeah, actually, I made a mistake when I said the highest was a C plus. The highest, excluding rail, was a C plus. Rail got a B.
Right.
So they were up there high.
Yes, and I subscribe to Trains magazine, and I've been reading where more and more of the freight companies, the railroad freight companies, are implementing positive train control, which is a lot of computerized stuff that basically stops the train or slows it down. It controls the locomotives based on signals from farther up the track, you know, what's happening up there and whatnot. Because derailments cost a lot of money, and there were a lot of derailments not too many years ago. There were a lot happening, I guess, because of increased speeds and things like that. But yeah, but the railroads for freight are very well maintained. Of course, the trucking industry is another big part of American commerce, interstate commerce, and if we don't have good roads, the trucks can't travel as well. I mean, of course, the interstate highway system is what created the trucking boom, I guess, back in the 60s and 70s.
Certainly facilitated the increase in that form of transport.
Yeah, and I don't know. Did you get anything on the state of our interstate highway systems? That's all part of this $1 trillion thing.
Yeah.
Looking at the two proposed infrastructure bills, and unfortunately, I looked for the one on the Trump administration late this afternoon. So, what I found was one from Vox, which is decidedly anti-Trump, but nevertheless, it talks about block grants, matching funds, federal loan programs, but it doesn't really say in this article here any specifics on what it's going to do. It's what's in Trump's infrastructure plan. Candidate Trump promised a $1 trillion infrastructure plan, and the Trump White House swiftly began talking about a $1.5 trillion plan. But yeah, they don't talk a lot about specifics in here in the article as far as what the administration has proposed. Did you find anything on that?
No, I do have some recollection of when it was in the news back earlier, months ago, that a lot of what they were proposing were things like getting this money from private industry to invest in public-private partnerships and toll roads and things like that, where they turn it over to industry where it wasn't.
Right.
They weren't talking about $1.5 trillion of federal spending. They were talking about a $1.5 trillion goal, that most of that money was not going to come from government.
Right. Actually, from what they say in this article, up until now, the split between state and federal funding for infrastructure was 20 and 80%, where the states provide 20%, federal government provides 80. And now with the Trump's proposals, that basically they're swapping that, where the states are going to need to come up with 80% of the funding somehow. And generally, I think that would be fine if we also cut federal taxes so that the states could raise more revenue, and if our state legislatures would raise revenue in the first place. But the big argument with the Vox article was that, they're not proposing, the Trump administration wasn't proposing any kind of way to come up with the revenue other than private enterprise, general terms, general ideas. Whereas the Senate Democrats, I guess they're equally biased in their projections, but they specify money for repair America's bridges and roads, America's water and sewer systems, improve public transportation, improve the safety of America's rail infrastructure. I wonder if they're referring to Amtrak there. But they have a lot of specifics here: airways, ports, waterways, airports, and airspace, innovation to America's energy grid to promote clean energy, high-speed internet. I shouldn't have poo-pooed the promote clean energy, but that just seems like right now, with things getting as bad as they are, I don't know that should be a major priority, but that's another thing altogether. But they also provide a list of ways to get the revenue by raising taxes, and at least they have a way of raising revenue for the projects. Whether or not any of this happens, who knows? But that it reminds me of Franklin Roosevelt's Depression-era federal programs, which many people decried as socialist, but they put 15 million Americans to work and prevented a lot of, a famine or revolt, rioting in the streets and whatnot. So, and at the same time, America got roads built, highways, and dams, power plants, and whatnot were all built. So we benefited from all that. And so that shows right there that, if we did set a goal to upgrade our infrastructure, we could employ a lot of people and have something of value afterward also.
Yeah, so that observation just set off a light bulb in my head with a question mark about, well, where are we going to get all the people to do all this work right now when unemployment's so low anyway? Yeah,
well, I would imagine road construction and building of bridges, or replacing bridges would require higher pay because it requires craftsmen.
Mm-hmm.
So, and again, where are we going to get the craftsmen? Good point. I mean, we don't have the people. Even if, of course, we don't know that. We don't know, at least I don't know the demographics of all the people employed right now. Maybe there are a lot of people underemployed who would be able to fill the construction jobs.
It's just a question mark that lit up in my head about where are you going to get these people, and then if you're pulling them out of the low-skill, low-wage jobs and you're training them, or they're already trained but they aren't using their skills, then who's going to fill all those jobs that are emptied? And then you get back to, well, in the long term, there have been stories about, well, the U.S. isn't going to have enough population to fill its jobs in a decade or so anyway. So what's this issue with migration, and how does that in the immigrants, and how does that come? Well, it's going to be like we're going to be paying them to come instead of trying to keep them out.
Right. Good point.
So who knows how?
Yeah.
These are all just question marks, but.
Yeah, in fact, one of the problems I remember hearing about with the Affordable Care Act was that when suddenly health care or health insurance was available to so many more people, we didn't have enough doctors to fill that need. And I think that caused some changes, or has caused some changes in how the, American Medical Association, how they handle licensing of doctors, because from what I remember reading back in the 80s and 90s, a licensed doctor from another country might have to go through several years of medical training in America to get a license to operate, here to be employed as a doctor in the U.S. I don't recall now. I don't know if that's changed, but we had burdens, we had barriers to entry into the profession, like lots of professions have done throughout history, and that's going to have to change, or has been changing, as demand has increased.
Yeah, it'll be a big shake-up in the whole structure of the labor market.
Yeah, so, the whole thing, rapid construction boom, which is probably needed, because we have like a backlog in our bridges alone of $123 billion. So any kind of a rapid program is going to create a strain on everything else, all the other infrastructure, causing it to deteriorate faster, blah, blah, blah. Just kidding. But, well, we'll see. Maybe that won't happen, and maybe our federal government will do nothing, and we'll be okay.
Our bridges will just all fall down.
Yeah, they'll just fall like the one in Minneapolis a few years ago, and the like. But let's see, we are just about out of time, Lang, and I don't think we got to anywhere near what we wanted to. I know world rankings was something I wanted to talk about, but that's kind of a fuzzy thing now too, right?
Yeah, there have been references to the World Economic Forum's rankings, and they're actually ranking competitiveness between or among the various nations, and they've used 12 different areas of statistics, and one of those is related to infrastructure. So it's a minor role of their whole thing. So there's a question about the validity of their rankings.
Right, and of course standards change and whatnot too. Well, we got to go, Lang. We're out of time. You've been listening to Wayne Parker and Lang Baker here on A Pause for Thought on Baton Rouge Community Radio, 96.9 FM here in Baton Rouge. We thank you for listening. We got to go. You have a good night.